At the time of this recording, there are 6 episodes out from The Last of Us Season 2. So far, this adaptation seems to consist in slight fixes, alterations and new additions rather than substantive changes to the general story and direction. In fact, at times going as close as being a reenactment from certain cutscenes in the game. Here is my prediction. I predict The Last of Us as a franchise is not long for this world. I predict Season 3 is going to struggle. I predict Season 2 is going to struggle by the end. I do not believe the following seasons are a safe bet to happen uncompromised, as, so far by the looks of it, one of the most controversial and well-known plot points is already having the same effect in the show as it did back then, and it is just one of many to come. I would argue, even though the show has a factor in its favor, hindsight, it is very clear they are not willing to make the necessary changes to fix Part 2's narrative. There was never even an acknowledgement Part 2 needed fixing, why will it? They got showered with praise by game media outlets with dubious criteria on what constitute good games and especially good stories, which resulted in that entry being lifted by the industry as this unprecedented achievement.
The Last of Us Part 2.
Yep.
I want to see the chat. No, Rick, gross. Dude.
In other words, hindsight will not be a factor here. In order to fix the issue, there needs to be a recognition that the issue exists in the first place. The other factor in its favor? You don't actually have to play through the game, which was loaded with a huge amount of meandering in between both the cutscenes and the actual gameplay. But I will argue there's a new problem with the adaptation the games did not have to deal with. The game only had to be sold once for each customer. It didn't matter if someone did not finish the game as long as the customer did not return it for a refund. TV shows are different, ratings are what matters. So it matters that people stick around until the end. Dropping the game after one of the many investment annihilating moments it is filled with did not really matter much. Dropping the show ceasing to watch the next episode does, especially for the certainty of a next season. The next issue, and this is a bigger one, this is not the full story. It is already confirmed The Last of Us 2 is going to be covered for at least 2 seasons. And without some noticeable changes, it means this season and potentially the next one are going to end without a full story being told, which creates significant challenges for it. First of all, the show has not completely dropped the structure of the original story. A structure that consists in giving answers or context through the use of flashbacks and anachronical storytelling to events presented prior of which context was obfuscated. Like, why is Ellie angry with Joel? Or how did Abby manage to find Jackson? Or what is up with the coffee grains? A structure that does not lend itself for a weekly show. Some of these moments fell flat in the game itself, where the separation was just hours instead of days, weeks, or even seasons. But more importantly, what will potentially be the dividing point between seasons was already a contentious aspect of the original work. Now the effect will be maximized due to the increased expectation caused by the increased waiting time between seasons, which will then be met by an increased version of what happened the first time around.
10 hours of 10? No. Wait, what? No joke, 10 hours with the Yes, it's real.
I will now elaborate on this. Feel free to skip to the last section to avoid spoilers. The Last of Us 2 is divided in 3 main sections: Ellie's journey, Abby's side of the story, and finally the last chapter, set after the events in Seattle, which will potentially coincide with the 4 seasons plan that was floated around, with the next season being focused on Abby if it is the case. This already in the game was divisive, as the first change of perspective was made, creating a cliffhanger that will not see resolution until, at a minimum, 10 hours later.
10 hours of Abby? 10?
Mel's pregnant.
Wait, what? Yes. You're gonna play the next 10 hours. What a joke.
Finally reaching that point and experiencing said resolution being another unsatisfying, underwhelming plot point. Abby wins the fight and manages to escape the group just like that. Now, Picture that this season ends on a cliffhanger or the promise of a future resolution. Rather than minutes, the wait is now between 1 to 2 years for the release of the next season. And rather than progress in the story, we are now following the characters we spent hours hating, and you will follow her until reaching the same point season 2 left, with barely the promise that maybe by the end of this, you will not hate this character, and that will be enough to compensate for the fact you still have to wait for at least a good part of the next season to see what happens next and to stop rooting for the character we followed for 2 seasons prior to this to accomplish her mission of avenging the best character in the series. Finally arrived to that confrontation at the theater again, just to end up on an underwhelming whimper. Abby escapes, the journey that took 2 seasons ended poorly, and suddenly see you in 2 years for the next season. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? The other possibility is for them to continue the rest of it in that same season and keep the momentum going. And there is a chance that this is what will transpire. The issue with this is, so far by the way it has been talked about, sounds like whatever they have planned will require more runtime. Talks about the series ending with 4 seasons, about the second entry requiring more seasons, about not having intentions of going further than the games. It paints a picture that the second entry will require more than 2 seasons to complete as planned. The closer the showrunners follow the original material, the more catastrophic the result. Some of the possible ways in which this effect could be ameliorated, besides diverging from the original story, will be switching the endpoint of Ellie's section. The more of a cliffhanger it is presented, the bigger the disappointment once the perspective changes to Abby. Maybe the section ends before the confrontation at the theater. Maybe it ends after the outcome of the encounter, easing on that being the destination. It also reduces the suspense about it, which is a good thing. The suspense will not hold for that many hours. It didn't do it the first time, and the underwhelming outcome does not capitalize on that suspense. The complication is that Abby's story needs time to breathe and develop for one to care at all about any of these people and to build Abby and Lev's companionship in a way that feels organic. The final section, on the other hand, is a tricky one. A full season dedicated to it would require a ton of original material, and waiting for another full season for this story to close will certainly test people's patience. Maybe season 3 could end the confrontation the second or third to last episode, dedicating the remaining ones for Abby's last section in the game and the fast forward to Ellie and Dina, easing on the idea of what the last season is going to be about, softening the blow. It ain't perfect, it is actually dire. Then again, so it was the first time around. Besides this, the unnecessarily anachronical, at times nightmarishly convoluted structure from the original story has now been streamlined to some degree, proven by the party scene, which was one of the earliest events in the story, chronologically speaking, depicted in episode 1 of the show, while being actually revealed during the latter sections of the game.
Wait, what? Oh wait, we're doing this still? I haven't even thought about this in weeks.
That being said, some of that structure is still present. Episode 6 is all about it. An episode dedicated to Joel depicting events that happened prior to episode 1, delivering context for many of the events in the first 3 episodes. It also has to create a cheap misdirection to hide Ellie and Joel's last conversation, framing the moment as Ellie walking into the house until the next day when in reality she turns back, and the moment leads to that scene. I cannot think of any way in which this episode benefits from being the 6th one, or what would have been lost by making episode 6 the first episode. This is the most common way in which this structure is used in the game, depriving the audience of context behind several scenarios first time around and compromising the dramatic impact those moments could have had for the sake of being needlessly cryptic. It is now being applied, doubled down in the show, in which the wait between episodes is longer than the entire playthrough of the game itself. How does that manifest? You see Ellie pouring coffee grains in Joel's grave, something that should feel significant. It is her goodbye to her father figure and one of the main characters from the previous season, but the significance is hidden to the audience, making this moment fall flat for first-time viewers and confusing for those who know the game, like me.
What are you drinking?
Coffee.
Where'd you get that?
A little embarrassed as to what I had to trade to get it, but
Not bad.
Due to the misdirection, the implication that that moment did not happen in this adaptation. Then the significance behind the coffee gets delivered 3 episodes, 3 weeks after the fact.
What are you drinking?
Coffee.
Enough time for viewers to have completely forgotten about the coffee grains, and it does nothing to enhance either of those moments. How about one that is worse? Hearing a character grieving her husband's death, which you will not care too much about due to the lack of context and lack of knowing the husband in question. 5 episodes later, the husband makes an appearance in a flashback in a scenario that would have greatly benefited from being experienced blind. It involves Ellie and Joel having to make a choice between respecting a dead man's last wish or keeping the people in the town as safe as possible, but the show already spoiled you the outcome 5 episodes ago, and hindered the effect in 2 different scenes through the use of this structure just like that. The game also suffered from this. It is one of the biggest reasons this structure is so controversial, and now it is being applied to a show that comes out weekly and a story that requires many seasons to complete. These moments struggled to land back then, they have even less chance of landing now. Presenting events and actions for which context will be revealed later in the runtime, presenting an anachronical narrative is not unheard of. It is not even necessarily a bad idea. The Prestige is potentially my favorite film, and it does that masterfully. The Prestige is also very methodical in the way the storylines are layered. It is also just 2 hours long, and it does invite multiple viewings, not a game with lengthy walking sections of nothing happening between both the gameplay and the cutscenes.
God f***ing let me run, this game is long enough as it is.
Nor is it a show that's still not over yet, and won't be for, at the absolute minimum, 2 years. Of course, the solution to this is to actually modify the story, which I do not believe will happen, as changing too much of it can be seen as an admission that the original material was compromised after all. The Last of Us is not long for this world. There are many points in which this show could be viewers again, kill investment that are still coming. I am not sure the HBO show will reach the end of this storyline without budget cuts and other compromises. And the game side of things seems to have already unceremoniously concluded with an oddly appropriate whimper, whispers of nothing in the horizon, and yet another re-release of the 2 entries, this time titled Complete. They wrote themselves into a corner with the ending of The Last of Us Part 2. Arguably, they robbed themselves into a bigger corner by making the franchise be connected to Ellie's story and potentially Abby rather than being an anthology series, and making Part 2 onwards about a separate set of characters inhabiting this world. It is not set in stone, so far, but it does seem, for the foreseeable future, Naughty Dog is stuck making this. It is not impossible for the show to finish its run. It is not even impossible to improve upon the original material significantly without diverging from it. It is not impossible, but I certainly doubt it will be the case.